Welcome to the What's Your Grief podcast. I'm Eleanor Haley.
And I'm Lisa Williams. We're the mental health professionals turned grief friends turned co-founders of the website What's Your Grief.
In this podcast, we talk candidly about all things grief, from pop culture to grief theory.
No tilted heads, no soothing tones, just us and our grief friends exploring the always devastating,
often confusing,
and sometimes even funny experience of living life after loss.
Hey, welcome to the What's Your Grief podcast. This is Eleanor, and I'm joined by Lisa. Hey, Lisa, how is your Monday going?
My Monday's going well-ish. Cool. Uneventful so far. How about you?
So far so good. I spent the morning going through some of the responses that we got to a survey that is going to lend itself to the topic that we want to talk about today. So I haven't gotten through everything, but I got through a lot. And so I'm ready to share with everybody some of what we found. So we're just gonna kind of jump into it today, I guess. Long story short, we've been doing a couple of surveys through our newsletter every couple of weeks. Maybe like we've done one the last month. We asked a question about topics. It wasn't so much a survey, but it was sort of. And this month we did a little brief survey about grief groups. And we got a ton of responses. We almost got like 500 responses, which is always great. Like I love it when we get such a big response, but it does mean it can be a little bit hard to get through all of what people shared with us. But it is so great to be able to have so much feedback from people. I think that there's a lot in the world of grieving, life after loss, of being in the professional world of grief and bereavement. I think there are a lot of things we take for granted or assume or just do or believe because that's what we've always done or believed. And it's always good to put things out there and say to people hey, is this actually your experience? Or what does this actually feel like to you? Or how has this process actually gone for you? And it is always interesting to hear the responses that we get to see if they really match up with the assumptions that we hold or that we hear other people holding.
Yeah, no, I think it is interesting. And this one is part of why we were thinking about this. And the questions that we asked was because we had a journalist reach out to us with some questions about our perceptions of how easy or difficult it is for people to find grief support groups. Mm-hmm. And I was really hesitant in talking to her, even though obviously we interact with lots of people grieving all the time between the website, the hub, podcast listeners, social media, whatever. My perceptions are anecdotal from that. And so as I was talking to her about it, I said, I can really only offer you my anecdotal perception. And that may be really on point, or that might be really off base. So it always feels helpful in those moments when I'm like, okay, people are interested. Someone's asking this question for a reason.
Yeah.
It would be helpful to actually talk to people and ask the question and see if we can get some real data.
Well, and I think the thing that's tricky about grief groups and talking about grief groups is that one person's experience is usually indicative of only one person's experience, because for better or worse, and probably for worse, the world of grief groups, the landscape is just so variable. There's not a lot of consistency. Groups come and they go, the makeups come and they go, the guidelines, the restrictions, the facilitators, the approach, everything is so varied. There's not a ton of consistency. There are some groups that we know are tried and true to always have groups reliably. Like an example of that would be I always know that the Compassionate Friends has groups. Now, do I know anything about the facilitators or the makeup of that group? No, because it just really depends. And so that's what's tough, is that there's so much variability. We've talked in the past about how can we link up people with groups, what could we do with our platform to offer a space for that? And it's hard for even us. We could put a directory up, but you know what? Within 6 months, that directory would be really out of date because the time and the date and whether or not this is actually happening changes. So often. And so it's really tough because everyone's experience is just so different. And when we ask questions about this, I think that we got answers that really reflected that as well.
I mean, I'm excited to hear about this because I have not looked at the data that came in yet. So I'm looking forward to hearing it from you.
Well, and to be fair, the data is probably going to be like more interesting to us than a lot of our listeners. Like there's definitely stuff that we asked and got responses about that is like, meh, whatever. But I think I'll share just kind of like the general points from each of the things that we asked. Because who knows, it might be interesting to someone. Really quick caveat about this survey, like this would not pass muster for anything close to like a research type of survey. We truly just threw this up in a Google form. When I first put it up, I put the wrong question format in so people couldn't give multiple answers. And then like after a half hour, I realized that and changed it. And so this is not by any stretch something that is sort of like research approach to
this isn't going to show up in JAMA anytime soon.
Absolutely not. No, but I do honestly, it's not going to. And there's a lot of things that I realize afterwards, like, oh, I should have asked this differently or we should have done this differently. However, I do feel like these snapshots are often just as helpful to me as something that would show up in a research paper. So
absolutely.
Not for nothing.
And after we talk about the data, we are going to talk about just like some other stuff about groups.
Yeah.
True. Sure. Because I think it opens up a lot of thinking about just groups in general and who are groups helpful for, and how do you even understand this landscape of groups? Because it is a complicated landscape, like you said.
Yeah, absolutely. Before actually getting into it, I will say when we put this out, of course, it's important to know who had access to the survey, and it would be everybody on our newsletter list. So we're already talking about people who have sort of self-selected into getting support from What's Your Grief. So people who are already kind of online getting support through us. So that's going to be a certain subset of people already right there. And we also said that we wanted to hear from people whether or not they even went to a grief group. If they even searched for a grief group, we wanted to hear from them. My guess would be that the most of the people who did take the step to respond would be skewed towards people who actually did utilize a grief group or had a very kind of distinct experience with a grief group. Maybe that distinct experience was that they didn't find one and they were turned away from a grief group. So that is my guess about the people who sort of self-selected into doing the survey. So as I said, we first asked people how they looked for grief group options. And of course, as one might expect, the vast majority of people are Googling online, and that's how they're getting linked up. Interestingly, the internet has changed so much. Google has changed so much. I do wonder how that is influencing the results that people are getting. I find that when I put in a Google search now, I always end up at Reddit. Almost always. And for people to know, a lot of the like smaller organizations are not getting top billing in Google results anymore. A lot of times you're going to end up with one of the bigger publications. And so this could be less reliable right now than it has been in the past, just for people to like be aware. You might need to scroll down a couple pages or be pretty specific in what you're looking for.
Yeah, I think like being really specific has become what is critical with Google these days. I think it really is like, okay, how can I, instead of just putting in 3 words, which maybe worked 7 years ago, I feel like now you have to be like, let me put in a full, thoughtful sentence.
Yeah. So just an aside for people to know when they're looking. A lot of people had a friend or a community member recommend a group. And that's great. If you have somebody who can recommend, that's always helpful because then you can ask them questions, kind of like on the side, like, okay, wait, but like, tell me, what's the facilitator like? What are the people like? Because when we look at the things that made a group feel more positive or negative, those factors had a huge impact on people. So I think it's great if you have someone in your life who you can ask and who can give you a recommendation. Now, they may not know. They may just be like, oh, I heard, that hospice has groups. They may not have like detailed knowledge, but it's helpful if you can ask questions. Other big places that people were finding, if you're associated with a hospice, a lot of times they'll have grief groups. Now, sometimes they'll have restrictions about whether or not your loved one was a patient at the hospice, how far out you are from your loss, things like that. Not all hospices, but many do. So yeah.
I think one thing people don't know about hospices, and I don't want us to falsely reinforce a myth, people will sometimes assume that patients do have to have been, or family members have to have been a patient of that hospice. And sometimes they do have groups that are just for that, but hospices are required to offer community grief support to anyone in the community, even if your family member wasn't a hospice patient. So it's part of their requirement in order to get Medicare reimbursement. They have to have some sort of community bereavement services. Now there's like a big range on what that is. There's not it's not consistent from hospice to hospice, but don't assume just because your family member wasn't a hospice patient that you shouldn't call and check. It might not be that they can offer you individual or group or whatever, but they likely have something that they can offer you and information and support and resources. So I just want to make sure we don't reinforce this belief people have of if my family member wasn't a hospice patient, they can't offer me anything.
Yeah, definitely asking the question can be helpful. One of the takeaways I have after kind of looking at this data is that going into this process, I think people think a lot of times they do it because this is the one thing they can think of, or somebody recommended this, or they think it's going to meet a certain need and they kind of jump into it, which is fine and even good. We don't want you sitting around perseverating over should I or shouldn't I. However, know that you might have to make a few contacts, know that you might have to ask questions of different places in order to hopefully find one that will fit what you're looking for. Other places that people found referral therapists, of course, places of worship, funeral homes, a little less so, but often. So there were some other smaller groups that people found support. And I think that, there were a lot of ones where people just wrote in oh, my college counseling center or a senior center. So I think the takeaway there is ask oh, maybe they would know, maybe a lot of people had written in a cancer support organization for before the loss, or maybe a hospital. We don't always think to go back to those places, but those might be good places to go for the next steps.
Absolutely. And I think I was actually just talking to somebody who we did a training for the Alzheimer's Association in New Jersey recently. And they were talking about how oftentimes people perceive them as just offering support before, while you're caregiving for someone with Alzheimer's or while you have it yourself, but how they offer grief support afterwards. And they were saying how so many organizations that are related to maybe the illness or disease that your loved one died of that provided support before, you may not have been tuned into the fact that they were also offer grief support afterwards. So I think it's good to ask for any of those types of organizations.
Yeah. So the next question we asked was, what type of group was your preference in terms of in-person versus virtual? And so about 61% said they definitively preferred in-person. About 20% said they knew they preferred virtual, and about 19% said they really didn't have a preference. This pretty much matches what I might expect. I think over COVID, we got a lot more comfortable with things being virtual that weren't traditionally virtual. I think that goes both ways. I think groups providing these support services got more comfortable with the process of offering things online, and people got more comfortable with joining something that's as intimate as a grief group in an online space. So I think that this is one of those things you have to think about before going out and looking. Are you somebody who feels really strongly one way or the other? Or would you be open to trying both? And I encourage you to really think about this. I think a lot of times people will be like, no, I'm not doing virtual, because they're not comfortable with it, or it feels new, or it feels complicated. And that's totally fine if that's how you feel. Though I do think virtual has its benefits.
Oh, yeah. And I think, that a lot of times people are surprised at how much they like virtual when they're not
Mhm.
sure if they will. There is something lovely about being able to be in the comfort of your own home, about not having to go anywhere. Like, there's pros and cons of both,
Absolutely.
obviously.
Yeah.
But I think don't
Mhm.
underestimate how great it can be. And if you're not sure about virtual, think it through. If you live somewhere where you're like, I know
Mhm.
it's impossible to get privacy, it might
Yeah.
be a different thing. That said, I had a Uber driver this weekend who told me all about how he joins his teletherapy every week from the gym while he's working out. He two birds with one stone, does his therapy and works out at the gym. So who knows?
Wow.
Depending on what your facilitator is comfortable with,
Yeah.
you might be able to just join from wherever you'd like.
I am really curious how the endorphins of exercise impact how he feels in the moment in those therapy sessions. He's probably like, "Yeah, I'm feeling a lot better right now."
I was like,
um,
that is wild.
yeah.
Telehealth has opened up so many new doors.
Well, I think another thing, so I really think thinking about why you're seeking out these groups can be a really important piece, like before even thinking about a lot of these things. Because if you are seeking out a group because you want to get out of the house and be around people, well then of course you're going to want in person. I think if you are somebody who wants to have a group that is really filling a niche, because there's a lot of general groups out there, but many people will say, no, I wanted a group where people had the exact same loss as me, or they were the exact same age as me, or they're going through the exact same thing as me. It can be harder to find a number of people to fill up a group in person for a very specific experience. Whereas virtual, because you can pull from other locations, it can sometimes be easier to actually fill a group with people who have all had really similar experiences. So, just a couple of things I think to consider with that piece. Asking people generally why they sought out grief groups. We had a lot of different responses, and we gave people some options to choose from. And of those, 52%, so a lot of people selected that they wanted to learn from others who've been through similar experiences. And the next closest one at 42% was people who wanted to connect with people who had a certain type of loss. And so I think the similarity, the understanding is a big piece for people. 39%, they wanted to just generally share with people who understood grief. 31% said they couldn't find the support they needed in their day-to-day lives. So the group was able to
Mhm.
help meet that need, hopefully. 17% just said they were feeling lonely. Other ones that were in like the teen percentage area, wanting to share in a confidential space where no one knows me, wanted to help others who were going through grief, wanted to connect with people who had a caregiving experience. So that's like a kind of a niche experience that a lot of people have, but
Right,
not
right.
yeah, like a lot of people have that experience, but you're not always going to have someone else in a general grief group who has had that experience. So
Sure.
it's one of those things where if that's something you really want, you might need to seek that out. 8% said people told me I should, and 3% were just not really sure. So do those responses kind of align with what you might have expected?
Yeah, yeah, I think that absolutely tracks. And I think that piece of the first couple of responses that were similar about wanting to learn from other people and have that connection to other people. I think that's such an important piece. If you're thinking about, is a group right for me? If that is calling to you, like, a group is such a good environment
Mhm.
for that. And if that is not calling to you, that's okay too. Like, one of the biggest things we hear, I meet with a lot of new people who join our Griever Hub, and a huge number of people who join. I'm always so surprised by how many people who join saying, I actually did join a support group, and it was too much for me. Other people's stories were too much. Like, I'm barely hanging on,
Yep.
carrying my own grief and trying to carry other people's and be put in that place. Like, there were people on that list you just shared who were like, I wanted to support other people. If that's you, that is wonderful. If that is not you, that is also completely okay. Many times we are not in a place where we want or can support other people. And so I think this just highlights so well the really good reasons to look for a group and where it makes
Mhm.
sense. And if you're somebody where, like, oh, somebody told you that you should join a group, but you're like, I'm really not interested in learning from other people's stories, and the idea of having to support other people and carrying that overwhelms me. I feel anxious. We always say, try things, stay open, push yourself, and also don't beat yourself up if that feels like too much for you and these reasons don't resonate. It might just be that like individual support is a little more up your alley.
Yeah, that's really important, I think. And I think it's especially important because I do wonder if a lot of people just don't know how else to meet that need outside of a support group. Because I think historically, the things that have really been offered to grieving people in terms of support suggestions have been a grief group. Usually, I think that's the number one suggested thing is a support group or some sort of group. And then, of course, like things like therapy, books, things like that. Yeah. But outside of that, do people really know how to meet a need of wanting to learn from others? Like if you are somebody who's like, I want to learn from others, but I don't know that I want to enter into a grief support group type of space, you know, there are things like the What's Your Grief Hub. I'm just using that as an example because I know what we do. I'm sure there are other communities who do similar things.
There's lots of other communities that
webinars.
Do similar.
There are, you know, books, things like
memoirs.
that. Memoirs. So there are a lot of different ways to seek that out. And, you know, if you find that you're still wanting something more in terms of connection, then I think that tells you something. But I do think your point is important that there are a lot of different things that people are looking for and ways to go about that. And if it's not in the context of a grief support group, that's very much normal and okay. Yep. Like we didn't say this at the start, but I know we've said it before. Neither of us are grief support group people. Like neither of us ever looked to that in our grief, or I think would probably take that route now. And this is not because we think there's anything wrong with that. I just think that that's not what we sort of gravitate towards. And I think that that's totally fine and good.
Yeah, absolutely. It is like all about finding what works for you.
Exactly. So the next question we asked was whether people were turned away from any groups in their search. And 89% of people said no. And 11% of people said yes. And let's see, that was out of 488 responses. So, I mean, I think overall, like, seems good. I wish that people weren't turned away, but I do understand there are reasons why that happens. A number of people said there was just no follow-up and bad communication. So I feel like this is a takeaway I would want to share with our grief professional group when we talk to them about things like this.
Yeah.
A lot of people said that they were turned away due to the time of their loss. And it was interesting because it was all over the map. Some people said my loss was too recent. Some people said my loss was too long ago. Some people said, oh, there was a 1-year cutoff, but they had paused grief groups during COVID. And I had surpassed the 1 year, though there were no groups available to me in the 1 year. And I was like, oh, man.
That's a bummer. It feels like you should get an exception.
Yes, I would agree with that fully. People, only people under 6 months, only people under 12 months had to be grieving for at least 6 months, 2-year cutoff, loss not recent enough. So a lot of people had feedback about timing, which I think is interesting. This is something I would like to talk to our professional group about. When I went through this, I was like, come on, guys, like, why are we like turning people away from this? But then when I did get to some of the responses about why groups felt positive or negative, a lot of people did say, being in a space with people who were kind of in a similar place as me. So I'm like, I'm sort of torn about this. I don't like the idea that people are being turned away from groups because their loss was too long ago. I just don't think that we can make a judgment about where people are on their grief, you know, quote unquote journey or path.
Totally.
Though I do see people saying that it's important to them where people like that people are in a similar space to them. So, but I do think a lot of this comes down to some of the expectations that we as facilitators set and ways that we guide the group. So that's something that I really like, a note I would like for our grief professionals to kind of take, because I don't like the idea that people are being turned away. We can't both say that there's no timeline to grief and that there's such a thing as delayed grief and so on, and then also be telling people that they're too far out from their loss.
Well, and I think that one of the things that's tricky is like a well-facilitated group. I think, you know, you do have people who engage in a group and they're like, I really liked being with similar people at a similar time frame, and that is really amazing. And I also know from facilitating and being involved in and hearing from people who have had groups that didn't have that, that they're like, one of the things that's really hopeful was meeting people who were further out and being able to like learn from them. People who are further out sometimes find it helpful and supportive to offer support now that they're maybe in a place where they can do that a little bit more. I do think that some places are trying to, I've heard of some places that are trying to offer groups for people who are further out if they do really feel committed to, we don't want to mix it all up.
Yes.
I can understand that places have different philosophies, but I do think it's then important to not go, but we have nothing for you. Yes. Instead, to be able to say, actually, at least periodically we run groups for people who are 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever, beyond years out.
I really think that the ideal would be having organizations that were able to offer multiple types of groups. And that's kind of the ideal, but I understand why that doesn't happen. A lot of organizations have to run, they only have the resources to run one group. And so they have to decide what that one group is going to look like. It would be great if an organization could say, this group is really appropriate for people who are really new to grief, like, really new, 6 months type of timeline. I don't know. You'd have to think about it, but like really new to grief, because we do know that those first weeks and months are different, than the things that are troubling and distressing a year, 2 years later. We know that grief is still going, and it's important to have support at all points, but I do get why people are in different places. And I agree with you, Lisa. I think it's great when a facilitator is doing a great job, and when a group is set up to be able to really kind of help those people who are further along in their grief to be good supports and kind of that installation of hope for the newer people. But I do also understand why it doesn't always go that way. And so the blue sky state, I think, would be that we could have groups that for people in a certain time frame, but also groups that are more broad. Like, this group is for anybody at any point, and you could kind of choose which feels right to you. But unfortunately, I understand that that's not what a lot of organizations are able to do. And it's not their fault. It's just that they have the resources that they have,
Yeah, exactly. There's always trying to balance.
Other reasons that people heard come down to like type of loss. I hate feeling like people feel like their type of loss is the reason why they cannot join a group. But then I do know that a lot of groups are specifically for a type of loss for a reason, like a certain group might be specifically for people who've experienced death of a loved one due to overdose or death of a loved one due to suicide. And there's a reason why some of these groups, especially the ones that are for these disenfranchised losses, are kind of specific to those types of losses. So I guess I want to know like the intention behind it. Like, I hate to feel like somebody is like, some of the responses did seem to indicate that the person felt like the facilitator couldn't handle their type of loss. Or like one person had an experience where it was a younger group and they didn't want their type of loss to upset the rest of the group, is how they felt. And that is concerning to me, because I feel like that further disenfranchises people. So I completely don't want people to feel that way. So that's my concern with this one. Though I do understand why some groups are very specific to a type of loss. So it's tough. I think this is a takeaway for the professionals. How are we communicating, and how do we have a Rolodex? I know nobody has a Rolodex anymore, but
you just all of the people who are just a fraction of a generation younger than us are like, what are you talking about?
Okay, let's see. A contact list full of groups that you can refer people to. Because if you're going to say no, the best case scenario is if you can say, I'm sorry, our group is full, or this group is for people who have experienced the death of a loved one to suicide. However, here is specific contact information for a group that might meet your need.
Exactly. So I think it is our ethical responsibility as professionals, if we can't we can't meet all the needs, and we do need to know where to refer people.
Yeah, exactly. Not enough participation. For some people got Other people got that groups were too full. So this is where that kind of wild west of grief group landscapes comes. There weren't any groups. There were just a couple of, and then some people answered with things that felt a little more like their expectations weren't being met. So yeah, sometimes I feel like we turn ourselves away, and like that's okay. You know, if you feel like this is a good fit for me, like cool. I think also we want to keep an open mind, but also like make sure we're not wasting our time looking for the things that we actually want. Out of all the people who responded, we asked, did you ever actually take the step to attend a grief group? And 83% said yes. So, you know, most people did actually take the step to attend grief groups. In terms of how many sessions people attended, 10% said only one. So that's, you know, that's not that many. I thought more people would be like, I only went to one and then I didn't go anymore. So I was happy to hear that. 14% said about 2 to 4. Also, I think that's given it a respectable try. Maybe you got what you needed in that time. 19% said 5 to 8. 14% said 8 to 10. And then 43% said 10 or more. So that's great. That's a lot. Did you find the grief group helpful? 61% said yes. 20% said no. And 19% were kind of like neutral, good and bad, in the middle. So then we asked people if they had a bad experience, like what was the reason for it? There were a lot of responses, and this was kind of a short answer. So I can't like give a really great report out on this, but a lot of people said things like group monopolization. So there was one person who monopolized the entire session. And I, having led groups, having been standing in front of a group of people, I feel for this situation because we do want to give people the time and space that they need. But at the same time, I do think a lot of times it's our responsibility as leaders to make sure everybody gets their time and to make sure that one person isn't monopolizing the whole entire session because, you know, then nobody else gets what they came for.
I was just going to say, I think it's just a reminder, like group facilitation is a skill, and it can be really tough sometimes for group facilitators. But it's a reminder of why it's really important to be able to manage those things when it comes up.
A lot of people gave answers that were in the vein of feeling like they didn't fit in with the type of loss that people experienced. A lot of people kind of mentioned the age of other members. So, for example, maybe it was a young like widows group and they were a bit older, or vice versa. Maybe they were feeling like everybody else was in a later stage of life and they were, you know, much younger. And so for these people, clearly having a group where people felt like they were in a similar place in life was important to them. And so that was an expectation that wasn't met for them. And again, that's going to be hard sometimes. And so that's something we want to think about ahead of time. Like, what are my expectations? What am I open to exploring with people who are not like me? And where do I really feel strongly that I need people to be like me? A lot of people shared what you mentioned earlier, feeling overwhelmed by other people's grief. I do think it can be really difficult, especially on a day when we're feeling really raw and vulnerable, to go to a group where it's just everybody telling their story. And it can be a lot for people if they're not ready for that or if they're not in the right space for that. And every group handles kind of that differently. I think some groups are structured in a way where there might be a mix of that sharing, but also a mix of maybe a more structured kind of approach. But I think asking questions about what the group is like can be helpful to get a feel for whether this is going to be something. If you feel like I'm not ready to hear like everybody's story, if you ask the facilitator like, how's the group ran, and they say, well, everybody just goes around and tells their story, well, then you kind of know. Feeling that they or other group members were too early in their grief or too far on in their grief. So a lot of people did say that. So this goes to that timing thing. There were people who felt like, oh, these people are really further along in their grief. I'm nowhere near where they are. Some people felt like the fact that other people were far along in their grief and were still coming to the sessions was a bad sign. I have always cautioned people about this because sometimes it's like, I'm doing okay. It's just, this is the only place where I can talk about my grief. So I still come here.
Exactly.
Or like, actually, I want to come here to support other people because I feel further along in my grief. So it's not necessarily a sign that people are stuck, though, you know, I guess it depends.
Right. And I think that this actually also speaks to facilitation as a skill and thinking about how you structure your groups in terms of timing, because something else we've heard from people when they're further out that like hurts my heart every time I hear it is that sometimes if they were in a group where they didn't restrict, you can come for as long, it doesn't matter when your loss was, you can come as long as you want, that then they were sort of taken aside by the group facilitator and said, like, you can still come, but please don't like bring your anger in so much or your sadness because it's upsetting and scary to the new people that they might still be so angry and sad down the road. And it's like, oh, like, it is really tricky because on the one hand, right, that does happen. It can be scary for new people when they're hearing that from folks who are further out. And if you feel like you're going to let people in at any point, you have to be ready to think about how you manage that in ways that don't cause people further out to feel shame or like they have to edit and silence themselves in the group. Like they're, it's, I mean, that's, again, it's why group facilitation is tricky. So,
yeah. So other ones, a lot of people said that the group was too religious. We hear this a lot. There is like one of the largest grief group programs, Grief Share. I think a lot of people end up there and find that it is being run in a way that feels very religious. So people need to like ask questions. Like some groups are set up that way on purpose. So I think wanting to know that ahead of time and understanding where religion might come in is important. Do you have those were the ones that I had to share. Any thoughts on that before I talk about some of the positive factors?
No, I think it is a good reminder though, that, when you're looking for resources and support, it can be easy to feel like, oh, okay, I've found a group, I want to join it, and I want to take advantage of this resource that's there. But to ask a lot of questions, you want to, if you're considering joining a group, just like if you're considering a counselor or a therapist, it's important and it's absolutely your right to ask all the questions you need to ask to make sure you feel comfortable and that it seems like it's going to be a good fit. So it's okay to ask the facilitator about how much experience they have in general with working with your type of loss. If you are from, you have concerns because you are of a different race than the facilitator, or you're concerned because you're not sure if it's an LGBT friendly group or things like that, like ask all the questions and don't feel badly about that. I think sometimes we feel like when we're accessing services, we don't have a right to take up space. We need to just like accept the services that are there. And that is absolutely not the case. And like, please ask all the questions.
I think that is also something that happens when we feel like we don't have a lot of options and that's what worries me a little bit with, first of all, just the availability of groups, but also just people's tolerance to really like look around. I am that is me to a T. I don't want to do a ton of looking around and research. I will often just take the first thing that says yes, or that fits my schedule or things like that. And that's where I set myself up to fail a lot of the time. And I do think that that's often what happens is people, they feel guilty asking a lot of questions. They don't want to question the person who's leading it. They're worried that they'll set a bad impression before they even begin, or they, don't feel that they want to look around or that they even have the options to look around. And so I do worry that people oftentimes end up in a situation that is not ideal for them because of that. So now that we've shared all the negatives and hopefully not scared people off completely, if this is something they wanted, I would say like a lot of people, a much higher percentage said they had positive experiences. And there were a lot of great things that people shared about what made things positive for them. I would say, and we've already talked about it a lot, a good facilitator was really, really high on that list. So again, I know it feels awkward if you're talking to the facilitator themselves, but asking questions about their philosophy, their approach, their experience. If it's a group or an organization that offers groups, asking whoever's on the phone with you those questions. If you are getting a recommendation from someone in the community, if they know, that might be helpful. So getting an understanding of the facilitator can be really, really helpful. Some other factors. So we didn't ask about like a specific experience. We just said like what factors help to make it more positive. And some of the things people noted, things like compassion, non-judgment, having my experiences validated, It felt comforting to know other people were going through similar experiences, a chance to learn and share. Felt good to be with others in similar situations. We had common losses, seeing others who've been through it surviving. So that's kind of an example of somebody who felt those further along were really helpful. We had a lot of people who said same type of loss, but then a lot of people who said the positive element was being in a group that felt really diverse and different, and seeing the universality of grief and, coping amongst people who had a lot of different experiences. And then there were a couple of things that went along with like group structure. So a lot of people said things like clear guidelines. I think that hopefully is happening in sessions, and you could ask that question, like, are there guidelines for the group? I think sometimes just setting kind of like the norms of the group or the guidelines of the group or a philosophy of the group can be really helpful. Setting that tone, maybe it's a moment at the beginning, maybe if it's a group that's closed and people have to come every week, it's setting that tone in the first session. But being able to set that tone, those guidelines, that philosophy, I think can be really helpful. And then there were people who said things like a detailed structure was really helpful. An outline set of topics or a topic for the day was really helpful. So I think that goes along with thinking about what type of experience you're looking for, because some groups are just like, well, whoever shows up. And then we just kind of like open up the floor and talk, right? But then there are the groups where a facilitator's like, no, I want a mix of having a structured conversation, psychoeducation, a topic. And those sessions can feel a little bit different because there's a little more structure around it. This may or may not be what you're looking for. That might sound perfect to you. Like for me personally, if I were going to seek out a group, I would definitely lean towards a more structured group. But for some people, they might be like, no, that's not enough like sharing and connection for me. So really thinking about what you want, what you're looking for. If you selected the option that said I wanted to learn from others or from the facilitator, then you might want something a little more structured. If you were the one who selected, I just wanted to connect, then you might be more open to a more open format.
Yeah.
So I'm sure not a lot of that probably surprises you, though I did find it interesting to hear about the people who really gravitated towards the more structured approach, because that resonates with me as well.
Oh yeah, me too. I mean, I think that's some, like, for me, I feel this way in other types of group settings as well. Like I just know for me, unstructured group is not a format that works for me.
Right.
And I get it that other people like that format, but I find that really difficult. So it goes back to that piece of ask questions, find out about the group. Like you can ask all the details in advance if you have a sense of, and you might not have a sense of which you would like or not like, and you kind of need to feel it out. But if you do have a sense, you can ask.
I also think along with this, because I do think it's important to know what we want out of the experience. Like knowing that it's not ever going to be perfect, but knowing like what kinds of needs we're trying to meet and also the things that are important to us. But on the flip side, I do think, especially considering the limited availability in some places of groups, I think having an open mind can be really, really important as well. Because sometimes we do get ourselves into this mindset of thinking only a certain type of person will understand me and be able to help me or relate to me or support me. When in reality, like, the one thing that we all experience as people is loss and grief. And so I think that grief is just a very human experience. And if we can maybe open ourselves up to the things that connect us and that we share, it can be helpful if we're in a group that feels like it's a really big mix.
Yeah, I agree.
So we've actually talked about this a lot longer than planned, but I do think like, is there a couple of like little pieces that we can share with people just about groups in general that would also provide further information to help in their search or their exploration or thinking about whether this is something that would be helpful to them?
I mean, I think I hope in hearing people's feedback that it has maybe helped to clarify just like what are questions I should ask myself, like what is religious consideration. I think thinking about that, because that is one that we hear a lot from people, even people who were seeking a religious group that ended up finding that it didn't end up being the right fit. So making sure you ask all the questions about what it means if you're joining a faith-based group, like how that is actually utilized in the group, how the group is run. I think asking questions about the group format, like structured and unstructured, we talked about, but also knowing that some of the going back to like some of the faith-based groups, Grief Speak is a big one. Isn't that what it's called? I think
Grief Reach, right? Grief Reach?
No, Grief Reach is NACG grant.
Oh, wait a minute. No, I'm sorry. Grief Share.
Grief Share, right. So Grief Share is one of the big faith-based groups, and a lot of people don't realize that they use a big video component to their sessions. So you watch like long, like 30-minute video and then have discussion about it. And some people like that, and some people are really thrown off by that and are like, I didn't expect that. So just like asking questions about what the format is, asking questions about the facilitator is, so that is this facilitated by a peer, a mental health professional, asking questions about what their training and experience is. Sometimes there are peer facilitators who have huge amounts of training and experience in facilitating groups. And sometimes there are trained mental health professionals who have very little experience with grief and facilitating groups, and they've been thrown into it. So not, like you said, not assuming maybe what people's experience and what's going to be helpful, asking those questions, but keeping in mind, what some of those differences are. And yeah, I mean, I think those are some of the big things for me that come to mind. I guess the other things to consider are just some groups are really set time limited groups. So they're closed. Everybody joins in the beginning. You have all your members. It's going to be 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 12 weeks, whatever. You know how many weeks it's going to be. And then the group is over and that's it. And some are an open format. So each week it might be different people who are joining. You don't necessarily have to commit to coming every week or every month, however frequently it happens. They may be open-ended, so people just come indefinitely. So just asking all those questions so you can set your expectations, because sometimes we have an idea in our mind of what a group is, and then you get into the group and you're like, wait a minute. This is going to be different people coming in and out, or this goes on in perpetuity. How do I know when I'm ready to stop? All sorts of things. So just feeling that out and asking those questions so that you know.
Yeah. I mean, I think just even knowing that there are so many different types of groups is helpful, because I do think people often think that a support group is a support group, and they're all that way that they've seen on television, where everybody sits in a circle and goes one by one and shares. And some do look like that, but plenty do not look like that. And so I think just knowing that, because you might go to one and be like, oh my gosh, this is not the right fit for me, and assume that all groups are not the right fit. But if you have that experience and you wish groups did work for you, it might be worth trying a different one, because that one might feel totally different to you. So I think just, knowing that there's a lot of different ways that people go about this, and that if you are somebody who really wants to find a group, that it might be worth continuing to look.
Yeah, and that you can even find community, like if other people feel helpful for you, but maybe this whole group idea, you're not sure, knowing that there are a lot of other creative different things people do to do that. I think one thing we do in our Griever Hub that other people, I can think of some other folks who do things that are similar, is we have sessions that are like a creative studio session where people can come and work on art or creative expression projects that they're working on connected to their grief together with other people. Like we're on Zoom together, but everybody's just working on their own, and they have the chance to share if you want or not. We do that with writing as well, where people come in and we share writing prompts, and everybody writes on their own for 25 minutes. And then if people want to share what came up or any thoughts, they can. Or if you just want to use that space for a little bit of community, but where you're not really necessarily feeling like it's a full support group style. Like there are a lot of things that don't just fit into this traditional group structure that we have in our minds that I think allows a little bit of connection, but maybe not that full group format. So I think just being open and exploring some of the things that are out there.
Yeah. All right. Well, we've talked quite a bit about this now. So I guess we'll wrap up for now. We will also be doing a podcast in the near future, not necessarily the next one, but in the near future, talking about different types of therapy for grief, different types of like individual counseling and things like that. We don't have a survey about this one. It's more just about, what we know based on different types of approaches and things like that. But, I think that as people go out and look for support, it can be so helpful to know what is out there, what is possible, and what are some of those assumptions I might have about these things that may or may not be accurate. So we will be talking about that in the near future. So keep an eye out for that if you are interested. And otherwise, I think we will be talking to you again next week.